Thank you, Eva. I need to put my glasses on, I'm getting old. So, as Eva says, I'm a curator at the British Library. I actually manage all the curators that work with Western early printed books. But I was the lead curator of our writing exhibition. So in my talk, I'm going to tell you why we produced the exhibition, what its aims were, how it was structured, who the audiences were. I'll talk about a handful of the objects on display and why we selected them, what the purpose was. And I'll share with you how it went, which, yeah, you'll see. But thank you, Eva, for inviting me. It's a really exciting opportunity to come to Warsaw. So the British Library, for those of you who haven't been, is the National Library of the United Kingdom and an international research collection based in central London. We have about 1.6 million people coming into this building every year. So it's quite a big library, about 150 million objects in our catalogues. People come in to do research in our reading rooms, but they also come in to use our 11 cafes, our 2 shops, attend cultural and educational events, and of course come to our exhibitions. These exhibitions are currently held in 3 spaces. This is one of them. This is our permanent space, but there are also 2 temporary galleries, a large one and a small one. The large one is where the writing exhibition was, and you have to pay to go in there, because this was a commercial exhibition. So I'd long thought that the British Library should do an exhibition about writing. We've got the stuff. But as all our exhibitions are commercial, they have to make money. And writing is a complex subject. I needed an external ally who lived and breathed the subject, unlike me. Somebody who could convince our exhibitions commissioning board that the idea was deliverable and that people would come and see it. Fortunately, I had just read this. Maybe some of you have read it too. The Golden Thread is a holistic history of writing from ancient times right through to the development of PDF documents. I thought it raised a lot of interesting issues, and I could see that much of the research had actually been done in my library. Its author, Ewan Clayton, is professor in design at a university in the northeast of England. Maybe some of you know him. He's also a noted calligrapher, both practitioner and teacher, and used to work as a writing consultant at Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center in California, where the idea of the personal computer was first developed. What's more, I realized he actually lived around the corner from me in Brighton on the south coast of England. I met him for coffee. We got on really well. Everyone gets on well with Ewan. And together, Ewan and I reshaped my original thoughts into something more focused, more relevant, which I was then able to turn into a relevant proposal. In early 2017, after several months of presentations and discussions and some audience testing with people across the UK, I was commissioned to deliver the exhibition on writing and given the 2019 summer time slot. Ewan was awarded a contract to provide expert advice, which was the level of assurance that our commercial services needed. And I negotiated the support of 3 curatorial colleagues to work with me: Peter Todt, Emma Harrison, and Michael Erdman, all with skills that I don't have. Add me, and that's the curatorial team. So we started work. One of the first things you have to do with a commercial exhibition is identify the marketing angle, the reasons why the exhibition is being done now. In this instance, it seemed fairly clear that this would have to relate to the fast-changing nature of communication technology. We noted how we no longer have to use writing for all the things we used to. New technology offers other options. We can watch a video to find out how to change a plug or configure a new smartphone. We can have a video conversation using FaceTime or Skype instead of sending a letter, email, text message, or greetings card. And of course, we can now control a multitude of devices using voice-activated commands instead of written commands. Just think of Amazon Alexa or Apple Siri. And even when we do choose writing, we don't have to do it ourselves. Voice-to-text software is generally available on our smartphones and in our computer operating systems. All we have to do is activate it. As curators working with, I think it's 40 centuries of cultural memory, we could see that this kind of major shift in writing technology has happened in the past, without totally destroying everything that went before. Just think about how mass-produced typewriters flooded every office and many homes across Europe and North America from the 1870s to about the 1980s. Yet people continued to learn to write by hand using ink pens. Our marketing angle for the exhibition would therefore be, writing surrounds us in the modern world, but given the technological developments of the 21st century, what does its future hold? We would consider this question by inviting the public to look back in time to see whether past developments might give any indication of future trends. In the gallery, we'd offer a rich variety of materials drawn primarily from our own collections that would show how the marks we make on the page have continually evolved, how writing tools and technologies have changed over time, and how different communities constantly find new ways to harness the power of writing to show their creativity or to make their voices heard. We'd then invite the visitors to reach their own conclusions about what the future of this invention might be. Audiences. It's commercial. We need to know who our audiences are. So our marketing team identified 3 core groups that as an institution we wanted to reach out to. The culturally curious, these being regular culture consumers, probably you, looking for an exhibition to visit perhaps on a Sunday afternoon without being particularly concerned what that exhibition is. It just needs to sound interesting. British Library loyalists. These are people that come to every exhibition we do, irrespective of what it's on, because it's the British Library. They want to see historic books, historic manuscripts, and they expect detail, facts, figures, and they're looking for us to get it wrong so they can write in and complain. And design fans. So this is a new group. It's probably you as well, actually. People with an interest in typography and calligraphy and lettering and how the medium has adapted and been used in creative and innovative ways. That isn't to say that other groups didn't matter. They did. It's just for the marketing strategy, you have to focus on somebody. I'll come back to target audiences later. So that's the background to writing Making Your Mark. Let me talk about what we came up with. This was the gallery, what it looked like. It doesn't photograph very well. The exhibition cases were built into a single 1.5 meter wide twisting, say, ribbon that rose and fell throughout the gallery. The intention was to suggest a folded paper scroll connecting the past to the present and onto the future. We found space for 120 objects with their labels, as well as some short films and a handful of interactive games. The material was arranged in 5 sections, 5 different angles to the subject of writing. Its origins, the shape of the marks we make on the page, the tools we use, how people use writing, and what its future might be. So let's walk through some of these. Section 1 was about origins, where we introduced visitors to the questions around where and why. We began with something visually striking that in some cases would challenge visitors' expectations. Something perhaps familiar to people here, a piece of Maya writing. So this is a 2.2 meter high, 1,088 kilogram limestone stela from Mesoamerica, covered in Maya glyphs. It had been excavated by the British Museum in what is now Belize in Central America, and had never been on public display before. Although not especially old in terms of Mesoamerican writing, it dates from 647, it was chosen in order to establish from the outset that this exhibition was global in outlook and was not going to follow a purely chronological presentation of the material. It also prompted visitors to think about whether writing has a single point of origin or whether there must have been several. Some categories of Maya glyphs have been fully interpreted. This text, however, is one that specialists have yet to decipher in full. But the British Museum colleagues can tell us that it reports the throwing down of monuments, that is, a people being defeated in battle, and the ruler Kakuti Chan is mentioned. After illustrating some of the reasons why writing may have evolved, we moved on to section 2. So that was writing systems and styles. This part of the exhibition looked at the shape of the marks we create when we're writing. These marks, letters, characters, glyphs, vary considerably in the way that they function from one another, as you'll all know. And so we began by exploring the logic behind 5 different approaches, including Arabic writing as a modern abjad with its focus on consonants, and Hindi written in Devanagari as an example of an abugida, where consonants are accompanied by an inherent vowel. The largest part of section 2, however, was devoted to the evolution of the Latin or Roman alphabet, the writing system that would be familiar to everybody coming into our gallery, and also the one best represented in our own collection. Most history books begin the story of the alphabet with the Phoenicians, but we have no examples of original Phoenician writing in our collection. We also struggled to borrow anything. I can talk about that later if you like, but basically, by law, we could not borrow anything from any museum that holds anything with Phoenician writing. But we did not want to begin with just some graphics. Colleagues over at the British Museum suggested a solution. Take one step back and show instead some of the earliest Canaanite writing from Sinai, created about 1800 BC. This is what they lent us, the Cerebit Sphinx. So I think this is special. There are 2 sets of writing on this small figurine. The writing on the side, further up, is regular hieroglyphs representing text in ancient Egyptian. But below, along the base there, is a string of hieroglyphs that have been used purely phonetically to spell out Maha-Balat, beloved of Balat, Balat being the name of a goddess, and it's in the Canaanite language. Spelling words out phonetically in this way was possible in Egyptian, but was uncommon and reserved for particular situations, such as an unfamiliar foreign name that could not easily be represented other ways. But this Canaanite inscription only uses that phonetic approach. It's a system that the Phoenicians then adopted and developed further before sharing it with other peoples around the Mediterranean. In the accompanying interpretation, we were able to pick out one of the hieroglyphs, the second one along from the left, which is an ox head, and with other items from our own collections, follow it through its development through Greek, Etruscan, Roman, and through to our capital A that we use today. Even when a writing system is broadly settled, the shape of the individual letters continues to evolve over time. And so we next selected a range of formal book scripts from medieval Europe to show how the style of the Roman alphabet continued to develop. Examples included the Lindisfarne Gospels, written in the northeast of England in about the year 700, in a style known as insular half-uncial, albeit with the addition of some later Anglo-Saxon writing added in between the lines a couple of centuries later. And the French manuscript of De Spiritu Sanctu by Théodore of Orléans, written in the early 9th century in the influential style known as Carolingian minuscule. Finally, we concluded section 2 by looking at the origins of the 3 main styles of writing that made the successful transition from handwriting to the earliest European printed books, that is, Gothic hands, italic handwriting, and the humanistic minuscule, seen here in a 1440 Florentine breviary of Festus, and adapted at the end of the century into a Roman typeface by the printer Nicolas Genson, working in Venice, illustrated here by a page from his Cicero edition of 1498. It was this family of Roman typefaces, based on the humanistic minuscule, that of course moved on to become the standard typefaces we see in mainstream printing and word processing packages of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So it's important for us to illustrate these stories, as we suspected that many people today have not been encouraged to stop and consider the origins of these printed letter forms, something that had come out in the audience testing we'd done. The third section of the exhibition was called Materials and Technology, and changed the focus from the writing on the page to the tools and technologies that people use to create their writing. Initial audience testing with the public showed that when asked about writing, most non-experts in Britain automatically thought about handwriting with pens. Again, we wanted to encourage visitors to think more broadly by placing these pens within a much broader context of writing. We concentrated on 4 well-established categories of writing technology: carving, impressing, and incising, which all make 3-dimensional impressions into a surface; laying ink or pigment onto a surface using a tool such as a brush, a pen, or a pencil; thirdly, printing as a means of applying ink onto a surface, always with the option of creating multiple identical copies of the text; and finally, working with keyboards as a means of textual input, whether physical keyboards as on a typewriter or pop-up keyboards in lights that we use on our smartphones and tablets. Let me talk a little about 2 of those categories and show you what we did. We wanted to show how carving, impressing, and incising are all techniques that people have been using since time immemorial, but we also wanted to take the opportunity again to challenge visitors' expectations. For carving, for example, rather than showing an historical stone-carved inscription from, say, ancient Rome or medieval Islam, we found a modern example, a piece of English poetry by Jeanette Winterson, the words of which had been carved into a piece of stone in 2011 by the craftswoman Annette Sterling. So in these cases, we had stone carving, something that pretty much every culture around the world has done and continues to do. We had impressing, as with ancient Mesopotamians pushing a reed stylus into moist clay to create their cuneiform writing. And we had incising, where a sharp tool is used to cut into the surface of something which is then filled with substances such as soot and oil that make the writing show up more clearly, as with the palm leaf text at the bottom here. And in gallery tours and workshops, we also encouraged people to think about how some of these techniques find new applications, such as the impressed name and numbers on your plastic credit card. For my second group of technology examples, let's look at what we did with printing. We started with woodblock printing, and one of the treasures that you've always seen with Fiona was this. So this is the Dunhuang Diamond Sutra, the world's oldest complete printed book, for which we have an exact date of publication, 11 May 868, which we know because the colophon tells us it was printed using the Chinese calendar of the time on the 15th of the 4th moon of the 9th year of the Xiantong era of the Tang dynasty, which everybody tells us is the 11th of May 868. I'll just have to trust them. So this was produced using woodblock printing, meaning that sections of the text were carved into the surface of a piece of wood by a highly skilled craftsperson. The block was then inked with a brush and an impression taken on a sheet of paper. a process that could have been repeated numerous times to create near identical copies. But although this particular version of the Diamond Sutra was almost certainly produced in multiples, it's the only one of the production run known to have survived. And we showed European printing too. This is one of 4 versions of the papal indulgence, which Johannes Gutenberg printed in either 1454 or 55, almost certainly before he finished the printing of his more famous Bible. It was produced using metal movable type and a screw press in a process which I probably don't need to describe to this audience. But in England, at least, the general public showed through audience testing that they only have a very vague idea about the origins of printing. This exhibition was a good idea to set out material that would prompt visitors to think about printing as an invention, perhaps for the first time. We did it by showing this example of Gutenberg side by side with a piece of Korean printing, also made with movable type. This was printed in 1442, at least a dozen years before Gutenberg's famous Bible, but is the product of a technology that may have been around in East Asia since the 13th century or even earlier. Did Gutenberg arrive at the idea of printing with metal movable type completely independently, or was he inspired by something he had seen or heard that had travelled from China or Korea along the Silk Road? Well, I'm afraid those are questions for researchers and academics like you, rather than librarians like me. But we wanted to display relevant objects and open visitors' eyes to the questions that they raise, and help them see the global perspective around a topic which, in the past, was all too often considered only on a nationalistic country-by-country basis. Section 4 of the exhibition was called People and Writing, and looked at the human, social and political dimension to writing. We focused on just 4 varied communities of writers that we felt we could best explore through our collections. Learners, which we've all been, note-takers, which I expect all of us here are, artists and designers, which we brought together because of their interest in creativity and visual messaging, and citizens, which is our opportunity to look at the role that writing plays in identity and politics. This is a 2,000-year-old wax tablet with a school child's writing exercises that began our section about learners. At the top, the teacher has written out a phrase in Greek, which translates very approximately, Jerry, please tell me if this is really wrong, something like, accept advice from someone wise and don't trust what your friends say. The child has then copied it out twice below. As you can see, they wouldn't have got a gold star. They've missed the first sigma twice. They've run over the edge and onto the wooden surround. They've been inconsistent in letter size and shape. And in fact, they've misspelled the final word on the tablet, perhaps saying something about their pronunciation in their particular part of Greece, of Egypt, in fact. But isn't it touching to see that learning to write through repetition hasn't really changed over the millennia? The audience actually showed that this is the kind of object they found it easy to engage with. The final object on display in our gallery was this. It's a people's petition and formed part of our look at citizens and writing. It was created in Bengal in 1905 and is a protest against the plans of the colonial British government to divide the province into 2 in what became known as the first partition of Bengal, foreshadowing the mid-20th century partition that saw the creation of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. All kinds of people have signed it, some in English, most in Bengali, and on other pages, a few in Urdu. The petition was passed from town to town and village to village during the monsoon season, and ultimately collected 60,000 signatures. It led to questions being asked in the British Parliament in London about the motivations behind the partition and how it was being implemented. Our aim was to suggest that there can be a collective power to writing. Section 5, the future of writing, contained no books or manuscripts. Instead, it was where we invited visitors to think about their own relationship to writing, assess the artifacts they had seen in the gallery, and consider whether the historical trends that they illustrate offer any indication of how writing may evolve in the future. As a prompt, we provided 3 experiences. 1, a short film in which 3 people of all ages, some of them very small, shared their thoughts and hopes for the future of writing. 2, an interactive survey in which visitors were asked a simple indicative question about writing in the future. I'll come back to that. And finally, a paper scroll with pencils where they could write whatever they wanted to, but we asked them to write down really their thoughts about writing and where it may be headed. So that's a very brief run through the gallery, but as with every exhibition, there's also a whole range of activities outside the gallery. This included a full programme of talks, tours and education sessions for families, for schools, for adults, including a day looking at non-Latin typeface design with Fiona here. And across the United Kingdom, 20 city libraries held their own Writing Making Your Mark activities. So the final photo there, that's in Exeter City Library. Exeter's in the southwest of England, where they had some panels that we wrote for them, and then they had display cases where they showed material both from Exeter City Library and from Exeter City Museum. And of course, as with all our exhibitions, we had a book, a volume of essays about writing, edited by Ewan Clayton, our external advisor, beautifully illustrated with lots of original photography, many objects being photographed here for the first time ever. So how did it go? Well, let me start with the media. Unusually for a British Library show, this exhibition was critically reviewed in full by a number of mainstream national newspapers in the United Kingdom, including The Times and The Telegraph, and all of them gave us 4 or 5 stars out of 5. Yes. It also received international attention, including reviews in the New York Times, the New Yorker magazine, and magazines in places as far away as Iran and China. In all cases, the reviews were positive. Overall, there were 210 pieces of major coverage in the media, which is exceptionally high for one of our exhibitions. Visitors. Oh, visitors. The number of visitors to the exhibition wasn't as high as we'd hoped. The aim had been to attract about 50,000 paying visitors to our gallery, but in the end, we only sold 38,800 tickets, 70% of the target. I mean, 38,000 is still a lot, but let me just come back to the point. We have 1.6 million people coming into our building every year. The curators wondered whether this lower than expected figure might be down to competition from much larger art exhibitions locally in central London. There were exhibitions on Munch, Van Gogh, all sorts of famous people on at the same time. Ticket prices. Full-priced adult entry was £14. That's 71 Polish zloty. It's a lot, 16 euros. And a marketing campaign that didn't quite hit the mark in early weeks, and I'll come back to that. Satisfaction levels, though, were high. We employed a market research company to find out what people thought. They undertook 401 face-to-face interviews with visitors as they left our gallery. They found that 74% said they were satisfied or very satisfied with their experience. 26% were neutral, and not a single person admitted to being dissatisfied. As I mentioned earlier, the target audiences in market research terms were categorised as the culturally curious, the British Library loyalists, and the design fans. We had an interim market research report a few weeks into the exhibition that told us we were being successful with the culturally curious and the design fans. And in fact, we were seeing quite a lot of younger people coming into our galleries. However, the report also told us we were failing to attract the usual high numbers of British Library loyalists. In particular, it was felt that the marketing strategy was failing to get across to older people like me that the exhibition was full of examples of stunning calligraphy from Europe, Africa, Asia, or the handwritten notes of famous historical figures. There was Mozart in there in his handwriting, and we never told people. Questions were asked, for example, about the exhibition poster. Was it suggesting that the show was more for children, perhaps? In the end, the poster wasn't altered, but greater use was made of more traditional means of communicating with potential visitors, such as mail shots, using email, and using, dare I say, Facebook, rather than Instagram and Twitter, which we had been focusing on. The final report by our market research company at the end of the run, based on those 401 exit interviews, found the following. Yes, the audience was younger than average. It was the youngest average audience we'd seen in one of our exhibitions since 2014, when I did an exhibition on British comics. It found there was a higher than average proportion of women visiting the exhibition, a ratio of 60-40, and a higher than average number of visitors from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic audiences at 13%. That's important for us. That helps us get funding from central government. 13% is significantly up on our usual figure, which would range between 4% and 9% for people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic audiences. All these points mean that the British Library feels that the exhibition was a success, even if we didn't hit the visitor numbers. And the social media response was particularly strong. I don't understand all this, but I'm sure some of you do. So our 62 official tweets about the exhibition and the objects on display resulted in over 2.5 million impressions. So I think that's views in people's news feeds. With 53,000 engagements, which I think are likes and retweets, and the Twitter videos watched in part or in full over 72,000 times. And there you've got the equivalent figures for Facebook and Instagram. But they can't be the whole picture, because Facebook, we did a tour on Facebook Live, which I think is still out there if you know how to find it, of the gallery, a sort of about 40-minute walk around the gallery, which received over 500,000 likes. All of that was much higher than for any exhibition we've ever done before. And even in these days of social media engagement, some people continue to provide feedback by email or by filling in one of those customer comment forms that institutions like us have. Most of these comments actually related to issues such as the lighting levels in the gallery, the temperature in the gallery, or ticket prices. Those were dealt with by our exhibitions department, but 40 of the comments came to the curators for reply. There were the inevitable complaints that we hadn't covered everyone's favourite subject. Well, you always get that. We actually had objects written in over 40 writing systems on display, but our choices were always going to disappoint some people. And there were actually quite a few objections to the high visibility of Muslim religious texts, all from American tourists. Overall, 30 of the 40 pieces of feedback were positive. We had an awful lot of heartwarming comments about how the exhibits reminded them of learning to write at school, or using shorthand in the office, or the joy of writing with a fountain pen. So what do we learn about the public's thought on writing? Well, the most popular objects on display, if one believes the likes and comments on social media, Well, not necessarily the ones we would have expected. These were the top 3. So number 1, an example, a square word or New English calligraphy invented by the Chinese artist Xu Bing, where the structure of Chinese characters is applied to the letters of English words, reorganizing them into forms that look like Chinese characters. And most of the likes were actually from accounts in East Asia. The first book printed in Britain by a named woman came second. So this is a pamphlet printed in London in 1540 by Elizabeth Pickering. So if you think printing started in London in 1472-3, took until 1540 for a woman printer to be able to include her own name in the volume. Before that, of course, they were just sort of saying, either using their, say, their widows using the name of their deceased husband, or they're sometimes actually saying printed by the widow of whoever. And then the third most popular was this combined tweet we sent out on World Calligraphy Day that featured a piece of 8th century Japanese calligraphy by the Empress Komyo, a 14th century Ge'ez Old Testament in Ethiopic, and a 19th century Buddhist text, the Prahmalai, written in the Kom script of Southeast Asia. A quick look at the written comments received by email and on customer comment forms were more varied. The sample was much, much smaller. There are, however, a couple of observations that can be made. Yes, the 2,000-year-old wax tablet with the school child's writing exercises was clearly popular, as was the double pigeon Chinese typewriter. 2,450 loose pieces of type. So there was that scroll at the end, the paper scroll with pencils. What did people write on that? Well, essentially, that's what it looks like. The analysis is still to be done. There must be over 10,000 comments, filling 3.5 very long rolls of paper. The curators did, however, review the comments at various points during the show, and some were shared on Twitter or quoted in public talks. I would observe that most comments related to handwriting with fountain pens. There were a lot of jokes, quotations, and poems. A lot of people writing a few words in non-Latin writing systems. A lot of Chinese, I think there's some Arabic there, there's some Chinese and Arabic there. Japanese, Devanagari, and esoteric ones. So yes, there were Egyptian hieroglyphs. I'm sure we didn't actually have any ancient Egyptians. And we must have had some elves because there was some Tengwa in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings script, which we saw earlier. Disappointingly, we didn't see anything, or haven't spotted anything, substantial about the benefits of or the opportunities offered by new writing-related hardware or software, which is kind of what we were prompting all around in that area. The scrolls are now with my colleagues in another team, the contemporary British team, who are seeking funding to have them, first of all, stabilised by conservators because the paper got ripped at various points, and then they'll be digitised. And the hope is we can make them available to a research project in the future, perhaps as a digital humanities research project. How did people respond to the survey at the end of the exhibition? As I mentioned, next to the paper scroll at the end, there was this digital survey with an accompanying infographic display thing. It asked one simple question: how will we send birthday greetings in 50 years' time? And then you had some options, and you chose one of those. Over 19,000 people answered the question. Top answer, what do you think? Yeah, handwrite a card, handwrite a card. 31% of people said handwrite. And the second top message was record a video message at 22%. I think others will have to judge whether the British Library's exhibition contributed something useful to the public understanding of writing in its various forms, and whether our displays inspired creative minds or prompted researchers to explore new ideas. Commercially, it was a success, in fact, because although we didn't see the numbers that we hoped, it was actually quite a lot of people. And the exhibition will now be travelling to China, and we will be paid for it to be displayed in Shanghai Public Library and Chengdu Museum. Other institutions are in discussion. That's where we make our money. From the curatorial side, we felt that we gave a good indication of the richness of the collections at the British Library. As I said, documents in over 40 writing systems were on display, with dozens more we could easily have selected. And we showed a good range of writing styles, from high-status calligraphy to rough note-taking and landmark examples of printing. And we considered lots of writing technologies: handwriting, letterpress printing, carving, typing, all of those sorts of things. We also felt that the evidence was on display among the historical material to point to two possible observations about the future of printing. First, that no aspect of printing has ever been static. Writing systems and styles have always been in a constant state of evolution. New tools, materials and technologies have repeatedly come along, and people can and do find new ways to harness the power of writing. Second, when new writing materials or technologies are developed, I think we showed that the old ones are rarely abandoned. Instead, older tools, materials, techniques either continue alongside the newer ones, as with pens alongside keyboards, or else they find themselves used for specialist or artistic uses. So think about 2011 stone carving of a poem. The arrival of new materials and technologies seems in fact to add to the range of options to us when we write. But let me finish by returning to the original marketing phrase for the exhibition, that writing surrounds us in the modern world. But given the technological developments of the 21st century, what does its future hold? Well, I don't think we were able to answer that. But I think what the exhibition did do was it provided evidence for a degree of optimism, both in terms of the two conclusions I've just proposed, but optimism also because the exhibition showed, particularly through the audience profile and in the responses on social media and in the attendance at events and workshops, that young people care about writing. And it's that optimism that I'd like to leave you with at the end of this presentation. Thank you.